Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So it's very nice to be here this evening, and Hermann and I are going to do a double act, which we've been doing now for many years. I first came across Hermann a few years ago now when we were crosstown rivals. Hermann had started a company called Acorn Computers, and I was working for a guy called Clive Sinclair behind Sinclair. And for a number of years, we were in deadly rival with each other. Things evolved from there, and Hermann went off in his direction, started another company called Arm, which was a huge success, and then invited me to join a company which ultimately became Verata, which itself became a big success. So my evolution into success was down to Hermann's invitation. And since then, we've been investing together in companies, we've been on boards together, and cemented that whole relationship by becoming neighbors a few years ago. And I was intrigued to hear from Shai earlier this evening that Ranulph Fiennes, I think he told me, raised £15 million last week as a result of his presentation. So Hermann and I were thinking that this evening we'd pass the hat round and perhaps we could mount an expedition to Newnham. And I know that Shai and Mark Littlewood and Hermann and I would much appreciate the funding for that. So all contributions will be readily received. So that's my introduction to Hermann, and I'm sure he's going to reciprocate.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see so many of you turn up to these entrepreneurship meetings. When Shai and I first thought about this over 10 years ago now, there were very few of you here in the room, and now we're filling one of the biggest lecture halls in Cambridge with it. Well, as you heard from Charles, Cambridge is a very active community with over 1,000 companies employing some 40,000 people. Not all of the 1,000 companies were founded by Charles and myself, but we have a good share of them, especially those that became billion-dollar companies. And we want to talk to you today about early stage to growth being lean, mean, and generous. And maybe I start off with the leanest of them all, which was Acorn Computers, because Acorn Computers never raised more than £200. And when we took it public, it was worth 200 million. So it's still the only company I know of anywhere in the world that had a capital gain of a millionfold. So every pound that we put into the company was worth £1 million at the time that we took it public. A feat that Sinclair, of course, never managed to achieve.
I should comment at this point that up until the point where he founded Acorn, he had an absolutely stellar career as a scientist, as a PhD. And I have to ask you, Hermann, when did it all really start to go wrong?
Well, when Chris came round and said he wanted to start a company because he was so fed up with Clive Sinclair. This is the truth. And I said, okay, how much does it cost? And his answer was 100 quid. Do you have 50? And I said, yes, I've got 50 quid. And this is now, going back a few years, 1978. And if it had cost £1,000 in those days, which it did in lots of other European countries, we would have never started the company. But because it cost £50 each, we had £50, and we started the company. So actually, having really low thresholds for people to get started in their companies, I think, is one of the great advantages of Britain still over many other countries, and long shall it remain so.
Absolutely, and Hermann and I were talking before we started this evening, and we're just chatting about why now is a good time for some of you to think about starting a company. I know not all of you this evening have that as your objective, but I think an increasing number of you either already have or will have in the future, because it's an exciting world, and certainly it's a world in which you can apply the science and technology learning and experience that many of you are building, and can enjoy a direction for your lives in entrepreneurial business, which certainly from my point of view is it is absolutely unbeatable. So why is now a good time to be doing it? I can tell you that because in 5 years' time, if we come back, we will tell you that 5 years ago was a better time to start a business. And that's been the case for all time elapsed. So today, you look back and say, well, it was easier to start a business 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. As Hermann was saying, you know, the entry fee was quite modest, and perhaps when we look back on today, we'll see that the entry barriers just may be at their lowest. So if you are truly thinking about starting a company, this is a very good time to start. And Hermann, you may want to add to that.
Who has heard of Ray Kurzweil? Who knows the singularity is near? Right, read it. It will tell you in many very convincing graphs that the world grows exponentially in pretty much any technology field that you care to mention. The one that, of course, he is most familiar with is computing, and he's got this fantastic log graph that actually goes back to the 19th century with mechanical calculators. And he shows that through all the different technology innovations, from mechanical, then to electromechanical, then to valve machines, then to transistors. So these are very, very sort of fundamental technology shifts. The speed of computing inexorably rose on a linear graph as long as the y-axis is a log scale. So, you know, in real time, of course, an exponential graph. Why do I mention this? Well, I mention this because Charles rightly said, now is the best time to start a company. There are now more new technologies, more new ideas coming out of many universities, but in particular this university, that warrant commercialization. And they're increasing in speed, as this book shows very dramatically. And you've got a chance, because clearly you're interested in entrepreneurial activity, to grab hold of some of these new technologies and build companies out of them. And partially because of events like this, there is now a fantastic infrastructure that we've built up in Cambridge to support you. There is infrastructure in, probably the most important infrastructure is actually the infrastructure of this network, of the people in this room that are willing to support each other, and a network to other people that can help you. But we have a lot of infrastructure in terms of accountants who know how to deal with startups, of lawyers who are willing to take an early punt on the startup because they know later on they'll make more money with you, of people in the university who are now very supportive of entrepreneurship when 20 years ago they were not, and of professors and students who do the same. So take advantage of this new environment. Do something.
Absolutely. And it all starts with an idea. And you read the literature, and everybody will tell you that ideas are cheap, and ideas can be copied and so on. So how do you turn an idea into a great idea? And that's what I think distinguishes the really successful companies from the less successful companies or the unsuccessful companies. And there are a number of ingredients that help to convert that idea into a great idea. And the first one I'd suggest to you is thinking about it and talking about it to trusted people. Now, I know a lot of people are always anxious about talking about their idea to somebody else, so you have to trust that person. They're not going to rush off and try and emulate it. But the more you talk about it and the more you flesh out that idea into something which can be looked at from all kinds of different directions. One of the examples I like to use is that any situation you can look at through 360 degrees. And you can plot through those 360 degrees, and most people look at an issue or a problem or an opportunity or an idea through a very narrow perspective. They may look at it through a 15-degree wedge of that idea. As you talk to other people, they bring their experience, they bring their ideas, they bring their knowledge to bear, and so you can build out that understanding of that idea into a sort of a 360-degree view of that idea. As you do that, then taking it and memorializing, writing it down, because at some stage in the future, we'll come on to that in a moment or two, you're going to engage with other people who you want to be able to communicate with. And writing down your idea and the development of your idea is a big way of making it work successfully. The danger that I think we see in many businesses is that the idea starts with a product or a technology or a service, and people rush off to start the company and rush off and want to be busy. The first step I would suggest is in turning an idea into a great idea is to be busy and think and dive into that idea and think about it, because it may not be a good idea. When you look at it in more detail, you may come to the conclusion it's not a good idea, in which case, rather than wasting time on that, you'd be better off in thinking up another one. And Hermann, you may have some thoughts to add to that.
Yes, of course, because one of the really brilliant ideas was actually put into practice by the company that Charles mentioned earlier on, called Verata. And the brilliant idea, we thought, was ATM. In fact, Verata originally was called, slightly cheekily, Advanced Telecommunications Modules, ATM for short. ATM is known in the telecoms industry as asynchronous transfer mode. And at that time, looked like a brilliant idea, because it looked as if ATM was going to take over the world, that all the telecommunications needs that anybody might ever have, be it voice, data transfer, video transfer, could all be done on the ATM standard, and that would become the worldwide standard. In fact, we were joking about ATM doorbells. So if somebody rings a doorbell, we create an ATM packet which will ring the thing in the house, but at the same time, if you were not at home, that ATM packet might travel all around the world and end up on your mobile phone and ring there, and you could let the cleaner in or not if you didn't want to. So ATM was really at the core of this company that we started. And it actually had 3 products to start off with. One was a RAID system. This was a storage system, which soon died because people didn't want to pay for it. Then we had the core of the business, which really was an ATM switch. And at the time, ATM to the desktop was all the rage. And IBM, the lead company in computing at the time, had a standard called ATM 25 for 25 megabits a second, so it was 2.5 times faster than 10 megabits Ethernet. We thought we were on to a sure winner because our ATM switch was a better ATM switch and a lower cost ATM switch than anybody else. But we were struggling. We were struggling because Cisco bought a competitive technology, in fact, that was built in the same building as us in Silicon Valley, called Kalpana, and Kalpana had invented switched Ethernet. And switched Ethernet had many of the advantages that ATM had. So this company was struggling until Charles came along. And somebody called Tom Cooper came into the board meeting and said, in order for this ATM switch to work, we had to have a little NIC, a network interface card in the PC, because you had to link the switch with the PC in order to have a network. And he asked us whether he could sell the chip that we had developed for our NIC card. And we said, sure, go ahead, sell it. Second board meeting, he comes along and said, could I sell some more of this? There are some other people who want to buy it. I said, the third meeting, half of our sales was this tiny chip that we developed in the NIC card that had nothing to do with our main business. So we asked Tom, what are they, why do they want this chip for? What are they using it for? He said, there's a thing called ADSL, which is broadband to the home, and we have the perfect chip for this. And as it turned out, broadband to the home became a major trend in the industry, and we had a 50% market share of that, did we not?
Yes, fortunately along the way we took off a little time to invent the internet, and many of you in this room won't recall that probably 11 years ago the internet was not something that was being talked about. And for those of you who are that old, you might remember dial-up modems and the frustration of what the worldwide weight became, WWW, that at 56 kilobits, it wasn't very satisfactory.
Oh, that was the top end. That was the expensive modem. Yeah.
So we had this technology, and what we didn't know at that stage was that there was actually going to be a market for it. We could see some early blossomings, you know, some green shoots of opportunity and so on. But what took us to the point where we got really confident about it was a negotiation with an organization that became our first major customer. And that's you know, one of the factors that I would add to anyone who's got a brilliant idea or an idea that can be brilliant, is to find that first customer and go and talk to them and find out exactly what they want. So up until that point, we had an organization of about 75 people, all of whom were selling telecoms equipment, and we were in the process of changing to an organization that was going to sell semiconductors and software. We found this organization with a like set of thinking in Israel called Orkit, and the CEO was a guy called Itzhak Tamir. I remember all of these things because for the next 9 months I spent more time in Tel Aviv than I did in Cambridge. And they educated us. They took us from a company which was good at making boxes but unsuccessful in selling those boxes to a company that became successful selling semiconductors and software because they needed to use our capabilities in equipment that they were building. So we went through a period of what I can only describe as pain. The pain was that they hammered us about the information that they needed, the resources that they needed, the support that they needed, and so on. So looking back on it, they actually helped to make that company. And along the way, as a first customer, they also paid us $500,000 for a license. So we also, along the way, came up with a new business model. And we'll come back and talk about business models a little later on. But one of the first points that I would share with you about this experience is whatever idea you have, go and talk to somebody who you think can be a customer. Because that first customer can help you enormously in building your business, can help you enormously in terms of understanding what their needs are. And it's a big part of building that successful company. And being paid for the benefit of helping them is something which really gets a company started and really gets your investors excited.
Charles just mentioned a very important aspect of any company, which is the business model. Some of you might have heard me talk about the fifth wave of computing, which is probably the best example of how business models can make and kill companies. The five waves of computing are mainframes, which were dominated by IBM hardware, the mini-computer dominated by DEC, a company that doesn't exist anymore, workstations dominated by Apollo and Sun. Neither company exists anymore. Sun was just bought by Oracle. The PC business was the fourth wave, and the only wave where a company, i.e. IBM, was a leader in two waves, in mainframes and in PCs. But there is no case in history where a lead company in one wave ever became a lead company in the following wave. And the interesting thing that we're witnessing at the moment is another one of these wave changes from the fourth wave, the PC wave, to the mobile computing wave, which is just upon us now. What normally happens in these mega trends, these mega changes, is that the new wave isn't just a new wave that adds to previous waves. A new wave normally kills the previous wave to such an extent that often they get either completely wiped out or they become a very minor segment of the computer industry, as indeed has happened with mainframes. Mini-computer workstations have practically disappeared. And my prediction is that the PC architecture, not necessarily the form factor, will die and disappear over the next few years. Why? It's always the same reason. It's a business model reason. It's that the business model in these mega waves that are, very big waves are very, very different. The type of companies are very different. The way you buy and sell are very different. So in the case of the mobile architecture, for example, if you take a local example of microprocessors, in the mobile architecture, people do not buy microprocessors. So if you have a very successful microprocessor company like Intel, which without a shadow of a doubt makes the best microprocessors in the world, but people don't buy microprocessors, you don't have a business. So my prediction is that Intel will actually lose the terminal business going forward. They will continue, of course, to be very successful in the cloud business, and the new business has an interesting split into cloud computing, into the server side of things, and the terminal computing, which I think will all go ARM's way. Now, why has ARM been so successful? ARM's business model is not one of selling microprocessors, but licensing them. And therefore, the microprocessor fight in the terminal business is not Intel versus ARM. It's Intel versus the rest of the world, because ARM processors, of course, are built by Qualcomm, Sony, Toshiba, TI, Samsung, LG, and all the other 200 licenses that ARM has. The fact is that this has been so successful that this year, not only are there now more ARM microprocessors in the world than human ARMs, about 20 billion, but this year, the value of the ARM chips that are being sold by all these different companies that ARM collects a license fee on has overtaken the Intel microprocessor sales in dollar terms, not just in numbers. In numbers, we've been outselling Intel 10 to 1 for many years, but in dollar terms. So do make sure that whatever business model you think about is a business model that's appropriate for the main trend in your industry during that time.
So you've got a great idea, think through the business model, talk to people, look at what you're planning to do through those 360 degrees, and then start. And think lean and mean, and taking the example of ARM, which Hermann was just talking about. ARM, as it broke away from Acorn back in 1990, set up its first office in a barn in Swaffenbolbeck, which was a very low-cost way of kicking things off. Put together a community of people who were separated from ARM, were very much dedicated to this new business that they were developing, and were totally focused on that. I think I'm right in saying Hermann had very, very little investment behind
$1.5 million.
Right, $1.5 million, which for a semiconductor company is very, very little. A couple of those that Hermann and I are both involved with have now invested north of $200 million in their semiconductor programs. We don't mention that other than to say try and avoid it if you can. But being lean and mean, particularly...
Still a lot less than 700 million.
The lean and mean is very important. We are in straitened times at the moment. Money is not easily available. It's very much the case that starting a company off probably means that you've got to do the rounds of high net worth angel investors and so on to get a few hundred thousand pounds together. And to put together a very compelling plan for those angels, because they're all experienced people. That's what an angel is somebody who has been successful before and wants to encourage other individuals to be successful with their businesses. So they would expect you to be lean and mean. When you get to a little larger scale and you're looking for the scaling money, then it's still, venture capital firms that are out there and so on, but they are looking to invest as little as they need to see a company through to what is called cash flow break even. So one of the points that I would encourage you to do is when you start lean and mean, think about other ways in which you can generate capital for your business. That might be provided by your customers, for instance. Your customer may be prepared to give you advanced orders. Your suppliers may be interested if you have an idea that's sufficiently earth-shattering. They may want to back your idea and so on. So don't go just to the normal places to raise money. Look around the place, and again, do the 360 degree. Look at all the possible avenues and talk to people about what prospects exist for raising money. So lean and mean is, I think, going to be with us for some time to come now. And the surviving companies, the successful companies, will manage on that lean and mean diet longer than anyone else will, and will be more successful as a result of that. Now, Hermann, of course, is used to managing much bigger budgets than that through Amadeus Capital, but he probably has some thoughts about seed capital from the Amadeus side.
Yes, in my opinion, there are two types of money. The money that you get from business angels or venture capital, that's equity money, and the only real money, which is the money that you get from customers. And I've spent the last 20-odd years of my life weaning people off equity money. You know, equity money is not real money. You think you got this money. You don't have this money. You have borrowed this money. Everybody who gives you equity money wants that money back at some time in the future. And with some additional money, of course, to boot. Customers' money, you never need to return because you actually give them something that the customer wants. And the customer educates you about what it is that he wants by either buying more or complaining that the product that he's just bought ought to have different features or ought to be changed slightly. So please think right from the word go, how can I satisfy this customer? What is it that the customer actually wants? Because it is the money that the customer gives you that will finally lead to your success.
So some of you may have seen the books by a guy called Mike Southern. He's the beer mat entrepreneur, and I encourage you to look at his books because he has a very simple maxim. If somebody talks to him in a pub about a business idea, he says, okay, let's see how good this business idea is. You see those people at the next table? Go and sell it to them. See how many they're going to buy or how much they're going to buy from you and how much they're prepared to pay for it. I know a lot of people from the sort of science and technology end of things have this thing about customers. Customers are people who don't understand, they don't get it, they don't see the virtues of the product and the technology that we're working with. Avoid them at all costs because they are unwashed, they're never going to get it. But the reality is they are the people that need to be sold to. They are the people who can tell you what they really want and what they're really prepared to pay money for. So I would encourage you to do the beer mat entrepreneurial route and go and talk to some people as early as possible. Don't just sit in the back room and produce the perfect product or the perfect service. Go out and find people who really want it, who you can sell to, and who can help you hone the product to meet their particular requirements. And that's what the engagement with customers is all about. And along the way to get to that point, do it at the minimum amount of cost that you can do. So, go to idea space, go to renting desks on an hourly basis, minimize your expenditures, minimize your outflows, go to places by bike, get other people to buy you the coffees when you go and meet people for coffee. Use all the tricks of the trade because that way you can be successful as a result of that. Life is not as easy these days. You certainly aren't going to find a queue of venture capitalists outside your door waiting to push £10 million your way any longer. Life has changed a little.
So let me give you an example of how important it is to know your customer. And the example is Solexa. Our latest great success in Cambridge. It's worth over $1 billion. It's a gene sequencing company. It started with just absolutely outstandingly brilliant technology that came out of our chemistry laboratory here. supported by two of our great professors, Shankar Balasubramanian and David Klennerman. They had a really fundamental breakthrough idea on how to do sequencing by synthesis rather than the other sequencing technology that we invented here in Cambridge, which used to be the basis for all the sequencing machines before, the Sanger method, which chopped up the DNA. So everybody agreed that this was just a phenomenal breakthrough, and we proved that it works. And we then decided that we really needed to, this was a global market, we really needed to have a CEO that understood how to sell to this market, which was mainly a US market. So we went to a guy called John West. And John West was in charge of a $1 billion business that he ran for ABI. This was a company that had a 90% market share in gene sequencing, and he was the guy who ran it. He, of course, knew all the customers because that was his business. So we said to John, we've got bad news and we've got good news for you. The bad news is we have a machine back in Cambridge that is 100 times better than the one that you're selling. We're going to blow you out of the water. The good news is we want you to do it. So being an MIT graduate, he was no slouch at understanding the technical details. He came to Cambridge, did his due diligence, realized, yes, they will blow me out of the water. They are so much better, so I better do it. And he did. So he joined this company called Solexa, and that's where the brilliant insight came to bear that made Solexa the phenomenal success that it is, which was really understanding the customer. And he went to the design team and told them that we were going to deliver a 1G machine in a year's time. 1G stood for 1 billion base pairs per experiment. And a number of the best people in the company just shook their heads and said, the guy is mad. There's just absolutely no way we can deliver a 1G machine in a year's time. And some of them left in disgust. And he said, well, you know, you can either buy into this project to do a 1G machine in a year's time, or you can leave. This is your option. And in the final event, both were right. In a year's time, we delivered a 1G machine to a very happy customer called Broad, one of the big gene sequencing centers in Boston who he had worked with for many years. But the scientists were also right, because we delivered a machine that didn't work. Now, he really understood the customer and knew that there was a big market for machines that didn't work, because he'd been selling them machines that didn't work for a very long time. Now, why would you ask? Would people buy a machine that doesn't quite work? I mean, it worked sort of a little bit, but not quite right. And the answer was very simple. You had to understand the competition in the market, which was just phenomenal. There were these gene sequencing centers that were all competing with each other to sequence the human genome more, to sequence new species, and so on. And the pressure on them was just enormous to have the latest machine. Now, if the latest machine promised them an increase of a factor of 100 in their productivity, they were willing to accept a machine that gave them a factor of 10, which meant that it didn't work properly yet. But it was still much better than their previous machines. And by accepting an early machine that didn't quite work, they would learn how to use these machines, and in conjunction with us, develop a machine that finally worked and that would put them in front of their competitors. And that's exactly what happened, and this machine took the market by storm. But it was understanding what the market wanted. If he had not done that, other competitors that were following Solexa closely would have gained the market share and the first mover advantage, and it might have been one of the other companies that now dominates the market, as indeed the Solexa machine does with a 70% market share.
So I think that's a great example of hiring an outstanding executive to take a company, you know, up to the next level in a major way, who really understood the business, understood the customer, and understood the market. And he's a good example of the fact that it's people who make great companies. And you know, we applaud the Steve Jobses and the Bill Gateses and these sorts of people, but all around the world there are lots
Charles
of,
Cottons,
well, and Hermann Hausers, yes.
No, we practiced this beforehand.
It's I think one of the key points that I share with you here is many companies, the CEOs or the founder of the company hires people who are less able than they are. The reason they do that is because they feel threatened. To make a successful company, or one that's really going to change things, one of the maxims I'd share with you is hire people who you think are better than you are, because that way you can end up with something which is extraordinarily successful. Now, it may be that people are sitting here and say, well, that's totally impossible, but at least have people that are at least as good as you are is a way to go, because that's how you make successful businesses, whether it's the person at marketing, HR, sales, technology, science, whatever else it is. Find the best people, because certainly investors want to be backing those companies which are the best in their market, and because the best people build the best companies. So I think that's perhaps a good point to open things up for questions, Hermann. Start off by giving yourself the best chance to succeed by putting the effort into thinking it through. And you're absolutely right, as Hermann used the example of Verata as a company that radically changed its business direction. And in fact, most successful companies that you can look at, many successful companies you can look at, actually changed their business model along the way, changed their market, changed their technology, and so on. So it's not unusual. So I think your point is well made, but at least each of those companies gave it their best shot to start with, and either they were overcome by changes in markets, consumer interests, and so on, or some other factors came along. But then, you know, they had a bunch of smart people who said, we can do something with these assets that we've generated and use them, point them in another direction.
I've seen both succeed and both fail. My first company, Acorn Computers, we were flying by the seats of our pants, and our business model consisted, our business plan consisted of, it's all happening in microprocessors. We ought to be part of it. That was it. And we developed from there, and it became a great success. Other companies are very careful and thoughtful about what they do, but it also depends very much on how much money you need up front in order to start the business. If it's a matter of £100, you know, you can take risks. It's a matter of raising 10 million, it's a lot harder. I think it's the best way to start. You know, you've got a little community of like-minded people who enjoy working with each other, and you know, take it from there. There's very interesting work that was done by Ken Morse at MIT that showed that startups that had more than one founder were more successful up to not just founders, groups of people were more successful up to 4 people. So 2 were more successful than 1, 3 more successful than 2, and 4 more successful than 3, but after that it declined again. So if you have 3 physicists and 1 MBA, that sounds like the right mix to me. Well, nothing would please me more but ARM taking over the world in the server market as well as the terminal market. My only prediction that I think has some credibility and high chance of success is that the terminal market itself, which of course in the phone business is already 90% ARM, will go 90% ARM for all terminals, including things that we call PCs at the moment. And of course, the first example of that is the iPad, which indeed has 7 arms in them, because although the iPad is basically an iPhone on steroids, the architecture is entirely a mobile phone architecture. The functionality, which is mainly web browsing, is indeed a PC functionality. And if you look back at previous waves, that's exactly how the cheaper, lower power, lower cost waves always eat into the previous wave. I mean, the last time this happened was that the workstation people just never dreamt of PCs being any competition for them, because they were toys when they came out. When I actually gave my speech 20 years ago about the 4th wave of computing, predicting that the workstations would die once the PCs grew up, and that indeed was the case. Now, there's a very interesting startup called Smoothstone in Austin, Texas, I believe, which is the original group, the original DEC group that did the strong ARM implementation that was then bought by Intel, and that's how Intel ended up with an ARM license, the only microprocessor they've ever licensed in. Now, they have a very credible program to reduce the power consumption of servers by a factor of 10. Now, if you talk to anybody who runs large data centers, the #1 problem that the data centers have at the moment is not performance of their microprocessors, it's power. They actually have to build the data centers next to big power stations because they consume so much power. And they can't consume any more power because they can't run the air conditioning enough to get rid of the power. So the power, if you ask them, is their #1 problem. So if you reduce the power consumption by a factor of 10, which of course is one of the great advantages of a RISC architecture over a CISC architecture, they've got a real chance of making inroads in servers. And they're not the only ones doing ARM-based servers. So I think they have a chance, but in terminals, I think it's game over for Intel.
I think picking that up a little further, I think ARM may well or may not be successful in the server world. It's a 12 million unit per annum market. Warren East at the conference I was mentioning earlier was celebrating the fact that ARM has just completed its 40th year in operation and has, 30th year in operation. Sorry, 20th year in operation.
20th.
Yes,
20th.
It's getting, boy, time flies. So 20th year, and as was said earlier, it coincided with the shipment of their 20 billionth processor core. And Warren was saying at the conference that he expects in 10 years' time that they will be announcing that they will have shipped their 100 billionth processor core. So a small market like servers today, it was going to be swamped by many, many other markets where there are multiple instances of ARM core usage.
And a good example is the iPad with 7 ARM cores in them. You know, you wouldn't think that there is 7 in there, but there are.
I look at this not as a venture capitalist, but how do you reward the people who come on the journey with you when you started your company? And typically, the employees of a company secure their upside from their share options, which is their participation in the success of the business as expressed in a particular form of equity. And to my mind, this is an extremely valuable way of compensating individual employees, and that this as a principle should go to all employees. In the companies that I'm interested in and I'm involved with, all employees become option holders. They all have a shared interest in the success of the business, and that requires that the venture capitalists or the angel investors recognize that the success of the business is down to the people. It's not down to the money as such. It's down to the people who use that money and convert that money into success. So I am very much of the mind that says that generosity is an incredibly important part of growing a business, that while we focused on being lean and mean, the one place that I wouldn't be lean and mean on is in terms of sharing the value of the business that's created with the employees of the business. And as I say, that all employees in the business should be participants in that, so that they are all proud of the success of the business. So I have to say there's some contention from time to time, because I've been the CEO of a company, and the contention occasionally is with the venture capitalists who say, well, we don't want to give 20% of the equity as a share option pool. We think that 17.5% is just fine, or 15% of the pool is just fine. And I'm just putting Hermann on the spot.
And Hermann says that there is a very long tradition, actually, of the 80-20 split. It started with the original funding of ships that went out to India and other places to bring back spice or whatever. But these were very treacherous journeys, and not all of the ship's crew or the ships themselves would return. So the split was that people who put up the money would get 80% of the return of the ship's load, and 20% would go to the captain and his crew. And this split of 80-20, I think, has survived now for many years, and is actually the standard in venture capital as well. Now, of course, it depends a little bit on the amount of money that has been raised. To give 20% to the team when the team raises 10 or 20 or 50 million is one thing. To give 20% to the team if you raise hundreds of millions is another thing. And so there is a slight adjustment with the size of the investment. But grosso modo, the 80-20 rule, I think, is a widely accepted rule now. And I also totally agree with Charles that it's very important that those 20% that are set aside for management are widely distributed amongst the company. So it's not just the CEO and the first tier of VPs, but all the people that make a difference to the company should have a share in these options.
Yeah, there's great stories in Silicon Valley of storemen and people with quite lowly paid jobs actually becoming millionaires as a result of being part of a very successful company. And I celebrate that. I think that's absolutely brilliant. Those are great stories when they happen. And I'd like to see more of them here. And there probably will be more of them with the success of ARM and autonomy and companies like this.
Well, if people have made a lot of money already, of course, you would expect them to put up some of the equity money as well, so that they don't just participate through the option scheme, but they will have some of the shares that they own themselves by paying for them at the same rate and the same deal that the venture capitalists buy the shares at, and we very much welcome that. To have people that have skin in the game. Of course, many people who just spin out from universities or have just finished their PhDs don't normally have a lot of money. So their main reward is if they start the company themselves. Of course, they typically start off with 100% of the company, and then they invite VCs or family and friend round in, and that first round will be valued at the attractiveness of the business plan and the proposition that they can put together. And they might well end up with more than 20%, at least at that stage. So it depends very much which stage and how much money they are raising at each of the stages. Well, that was the reason why I gave this example, not under the heading release things early, but under the heading, know your customer. In this is probably the one exception that I've come across where you can sell something that doesn't quite work because you know that the customer wants it because they want to work with you to make it work, because of the big advantage that the customer gains by doing so. But it's very much the exception to the rule that if you release something too early, and you create an impression in the marketplace that your product doesn't work, then you've lost your chance of getting a viral sales process going where people talk about how good your product is and therefore recommend it to your friends, and off you go. So under normal circumstances, make sure your product works and delights the customer.
Yeah, there's an adage which says you only get one opportunity to make a great first impression, and delighting the customer is a great way of looking at it. But there are examples where as Hermann was saying, even in the internet world, that things which get kicked off first are evolved, and they weren't perfect, and they get better, and so on. So yeah, it's to be avoided.
ARM has just become our first $10 billion company here in Cambridge. Autonomy now is £3.5 billion, so that's over $5 billion. Verata, Charles's company, was $5 billion at the height of the
2010.
CSR is $1 billion company. Selex has become $1 billion company. We have $7 billion companies, companies worth more than $1 billion in Cambridge. The other ones were Chiroscience.
Domino Printing Science is over $1 billion today.
Domino Printing is over $1 billion. Okay, that must be 8, because there is a CAT, was a Cambridge antibody.
And then we've got Abcam, which is pushing.
And Abcam is getting there.
And then, in addition to that, then there are a lot of companies which were sold for large sums of money, including many of the biotech companies. So I was looking at some numbers recently, that over the last 10 years, there's probably been more than a dozen biotech companies which have been sold for north of $100 million. So it's pretty interesting. And if you ask Andy Richards, one of the things he says about the bioscience world is that in the bioscience world, they don't sell products, they sell companies. But